Do you know what time it is? It's supernatural story time. And if you're easily scared, and even if you're not, there's only one thing left to do. Just turn off the lights, because these are stories that you listen to only in the dark. The Gnome. My husband and I were walking in a very old garden. It is off of one of Atlanta's main drags and it's public, though no one is supposed to be in it at night. It is maintained by a trust from its creator. There are some ancient trees there. The land has never been cleared cut. I was walking a little ahead of my husband. My eyes were caught by a shining green light in a myrtle tree. I went closer to investigate it. It wasn't a lightning bug. It looked like a huge dewdrop, about the size of a quarter. It shone with a neon emerald green light. I tried to figure out what light it was reflecting. Just then across a narrow creek whose banks had been walled with gray rock and the water ran at the bottom about 6 feet. Not something I would want to jump across in the dark. I saw the air get dark and busy. I can't think of any other way to describe this. Something knit itself together right in front of my eyes, very, very fast. It was a little gnome or a troll man. It was in a laurel bush not 4 feet from me. It had gnarled features and a long nose and scraggly white hair. It wore a vest and a slouchy hat of some rusty color. It did not move in any way, and it didn't appear alive. I don't know how I could see it so well in the dark. It must have happened very fast because my husband was only a few feet behind me, and he hadn't caught up with me when I stopped at the neon dewdrop. I was terrified beyond reason. I screamed and ran for the car, yelling that we had to get out of there. My husband ran with me, because it was night in a woody part of a big city after all. He saw nothing. I have always regretted the fact that I was too panicked to stay and see what happened or try to speak to this gnome. I was terrified. I can't figure out if I sensed evil from the apparition or if my Christian upbringing, which laughingly tells us that all these things are just a story, just kicked in. Other people that I have known have said that they have seen things, and I once lived in an apartment that a murder had been committed in, and that people tended to rent and leave. Another friend said they heard and saw things. But although a couple of odd things have happened to me, this is the only time I ever saw anything. Maybe it's because I never went back to those gardens ever again. Someone in the kitchen. The year was 1976, and my mother and I had moved into a house across the street from my grandmother. My mother and I had lived with my grandmother until I was 11 years old, so I was pretty familiar with the neighborhood. The house we lived in used to belong to an older couple. I used to remember when their granddaughter Shelley would come to visit. The older man passed away and the lady owner moved out and decided to rent it. The house wasn't really that old then, maybe 25, 30 years old. It was totally fenced in by a chain link fence and had no bushes or trees in the whole yard. So basically, if you looked out any of the windows, you had a clear view of that side of the yard and into the neighbor's yard. The house had a crawl space underneath the entire house that raised it about 3 feet off the ground, so anyone trying to look into a window from the outside would have to stand on tippy toes to look in. The entire house had a wood parquet floor, which meant that you could hear and feel when anyone walked around inside of it. I'm explaining all this because it's all part of the story I'm going to relate. Part of this happened during the summertime and then into the school year. During the summer, I was dating a guy who lived a little bit far away, which meant we talked a lot on the phone, and since he was working at a busboy at a restaurant, which closed around 1 a.m., we would sometimes be talking into the wee hours. Now there were 2 phone connections, one in my mother's room and one in the kitchen. I would take the kitchen phone and stretch it around the corner and lie down in the hallway. Only the hall light would be turned on, which was pretty dim. The rest of the house was dark. Also, since we were on a tight budget, we wouldn't run the AC, which meant I could hear everything going on outside since all the windows were open. I would be talking to him and then suddenly I would hear the entry gate rattle. And at first I thought it was a cat jumping over the fence into the yard. But then soon afterwards I would hear footsteps in the grass around the house. I would be petrified and tell my boyfriend, "There's someone walking around my house." No, this was around 2 or 3 a.m., which made it really scary. At that point, I was thinking of burglars, not ghosts. One time I got so scared that I went running down the hallway and jumped into my mother's bed and woke her up, telling her that someone was in the yard. We turned off all the lights and looked through the windows and never saw anyone. Now remember, this yard had no bushes or trees. It was clear lawn. There was no place for anyone to hide behind. Plus, I never ever heard anyone running away. Another time, I was writing at my desk in my room, and it was around 1 a.m., and my desk was right under a window which overlooked the backyard. I had a little desk lamp on, and I was writing away when all of a sudden I heard footsteps purposely walking straight up to my window. I froze. I was about 18 inches from the window, and I was so scared of looking up and seeing something there, someone looking in. I suddenly jumped up, knocked over the chair, and literally flew around the corner into my mother's room, again jumping on her bed, waking her up, screaming that there was someone in the yard. I investigated, and again no sign of anyone. Now these were human footsteps. If it would have been a cat, it would have weighed at least 50 pounds, and we didn't own a dog. The school year started, and my mother would leave for work before I did for school, and she always told me that if I decided to stay home, to let my grandmother know I was there. One morning I had woken up not feeling too good and decided to stay home. I remember I was awake, just lying there with my eyes closed. I heard noises in the kitchen, which was towards the front of the house. But this didn't alarm me since my grandmother had a key to our house, and I thought it was her that had come in to get something that she needed. Then I felt, through the vibrations of the flooring, someone walking down the hallway to the room I was in, which was at the very end. Now this is the funny part, because even though in my conscious mind I'm thinking it's my grandmother, in my inner mind I'm imagining a man, older and taller, which reminds me of my grandfather, which had passed away, but it wasn't my grandfather. This person stopped at the door, looked at me, and then came and pulled the blankets up to my shoulder in a very loving manner. Now all this time I'm not scared, thinking it's my grandmother, and in truth I pretended to be asleep because I thought that if she realized I was awake, she was going to grill me as to why I had not gone to school. Later that day, when my mother went to see my grandmother, 5 minutes later she called me angrily on the phone, asking why I had not told my grandmother I was in the house. And I'm telling my mother that my grandmother had known all along, since she had been in the house during the morning and even covered me up. My grandmother swore she had never been in the house that day. One of the last items, which was that one night my grandmother called us around 3 a.m. and asked my mother to check if I was in bed. It just so happened I was sleeping with my mom that night, and she told my grandmother that I was right there next to her. My grandmother said she had heard me knock on her door a certain way I did and call out her name. She had gotten up, and of course no one was there, which is why she had called. Another mystery. We moved out after only living there 2 years, and I never had a similar experience again. The Old Woman. Hi, I live in Ohio, and here's my story. At night before I go to bed, I close my door to block out the light from the hallway and the noise from other rooms. The way my room is set up, my bed lies perpendicular to the doorway with my head resting right in view with the door. One night, which started out normal for me, I distinctly remember closing my door, and then I went to sleep and was out of it in 5 minutes. Halfway through the night, maybe around 4 or 5 in the morning, more like 5 because I remember seeing signs of light from outside, I suddenly woke up from sleep for no reason at all. When this outburst happened, I also realized that my heart was pounding extremely fast and that my ears were ringing loudly. I knew something was wrong, but I wasn't sure what. I directed my attention to the doorway, and I saw that my door was open. Even worse, standing in the doorway was an old woman in a nightgown, and no old woman was staying at my house that night. Immediately I turned my head and closed my eyes, too frightened to look, and I kept my head away from the door for a long time. Eventually the pounding of my heart and the ringing wore off, and I dozed into sleep. This happening was so vivid that it had to either be true or a very realistic dream. If it was a dream, there was one thing left unexplained. When I woke up in the morning, my door was wide open. The small dog. I remember once when I was about 5 years old, I was in bed. I'm not sure if I had been asleep or not, but I suddenly heard this howling noise coming from the other side of the room I was in. I sat up in bed and looked over to the large window, where in front of the window was an old 19th century chair. Sitting on top of the chair was a small dog, staring at me and howling. I could see this clearly as the moonlight spilled through the window. At first I could only stare, as we did not have any pets at all. I also thought that somehow this dog had made its way into my room from the street or something, though I did not know how, as my bedroom window was closed. I managed to jump out of bed and run into the lounge where my parents were watching television. My mother followed me back into the room and switched on the light, but no small dog. I don't remember what happened after that, but my mother has said since that she felt there was something strange about the house. We moved years ago. Unusual sighting. This all started in 1975 when I was a police officer. I was on night duty working with another officer who was responsible for basically showing me the ropes. We were in the police canteen one morning at about 1:30 a.m. when we received a call to go to a disturbance some 1 mile from the station. En route to the disturbance, we were flagged down by a man who was very large and built. He looked really as though he could handle himself. He was obviously very distressed and begged us to go to a nearby house. I can remember this man was driving an old VW Beetle. I seem to remember that he was dressed only in underclothing and possibly wearing a dressing gown. We tried to tell this man that we were on our way to another call, but his needs appeared to be greater. He took us to a house nearby and was saying something to the effect that something strange had happened to his daughter. The story that he told us was that he had been a soldier in Northern Ireland and had just left the services and settled into this house with his wife. I seem to remember that his brother-in-law was also staying at the house. He stated that all three of them had been out for a drink that evening and had left a babysitter in charge of his daughter, who was just a baby in arms. The adults had returned to the house about 12 midnight, had taken the babysitter home and returned. They were watching a television program when they heard something being dragged across the bedroom floor directly above them. No carpets were on the floor and the baby's cot was in this room. They then heard the sound of the baby crying. The man's wife started to panic, thinking someone had broken in and was taking the child. The husband had tried to open the door from the main room to the hall, then giving access to the stairs to which he could go to the bedroom. They could not open this door. Someone had grabbed hold of a small axe from a downstairs room to try and get the door open. The man then told me that he heard footsteps coming downstairs. The baby was still crying, and a female voice kept saying similar to, "Hush, don't cry." The adults tried to open the door and eventually managed to force it open. They got the dog that they had inside the house, which was very large, and threw the dog into the hallway, thinking that it would attack the person who they had thought had broken into the house. The dog bit its owner on the hand and ran out through the front door into the street. Both the man and his brother-in-law went upstairs and saw that the cot was in the middle of the floor with the baby still in it, but it was awake. They grabbed the baby, left the house, I think in 2 cars, and the husband was in one and his brother-in-law and wife and child in the other. This is when the man in the Volkswagen came across us traveling to the disturbance. I entered the house and saw that the door was badly damaged as he had stated. There were a number of bottles of empty beer on the table, but I didn't think that this man was drunk. I searched upstairs and sure enough the cot was in the middle of the room. My colleague searched downstairs. There was no sign of forced entry. We were in a divisional van, a Ford Transit, which was parked with its offside or the driver's side to this house, which is situated in a small cul-de-sac. My colleague turned the van around so that it was near side. In other words, the passenger was now opposite the house. I was writing down the man's details in my pocketbook. I asked him if he had fully secured the house. He said yes, apart from a small downstairs window measuring some 3 feet by 18 inches. I walked down the path and released the stay from outside, allowing the window to close. I returned to the man and he gave me an address of a nearby relative where he was staying at. As we were about to leave, I looked up at the bedroom window that had contained the cot and saw the net curtain move and the face of an elderly lady appeared. She was wearing glasses and had her hair tied in a bun on the top of her head. I looked at her for some 10 seconds, as did the man who was with me. He became very frightened, got in his car, and drove away. This was the only ghostly thing I ever experienced in my many years as a police officer. I've always felt very nervous about it because I couldn't explain it. The house is still standing to this day, and it is in the northwest of the UK. More Camp Zama ghosts. I was stationed at Camp Zama from 1987 to 1994. I lived at Sagamihara Housing Base and worked at 69th Finance at Camp Zama. Before I tell you the scary stuff, I'll start with a slightly weird. Several times while at work by myself, I would get the feeling I was not alone. But not being able to see anyone or anything, I would just think to myself that I was just imagining things that would finish my work and get out of the building as soon as possible. On several occasions, I did see someone walk by the open door and thought that it was my assistant who came in early like me. I would wonder why he didn't come in. Each time I got up to investigate, there would be no one in the building. There was no way anyone could get out of the building unseen because it would have to walk past my door. This never really scared me at the time, but I always wondered how they did it and who it was. It wasn't until 1992 that I heard about the history of others seeing apparitions of sorts, so I'm sure it wasn't just my overactive imagination. The only time I was ever really scared was when I was at home. I had to quit sleeping in my bedroom because of all the terrifying activity going on day and night. I was seriously thinking about getting psychiatric help, but I kept telling myself it wasn't real, and since I knew it wasn't real, I probably wasn't too far gone. I don't know how many times I was awakened from a sound sleep because I could feel something or someone sit down on my bed. I had a water bed and I could actually see the imprint of something sitting there, and the mattress would move and the water would slosh, and I would be up and out of there. It didn't happen every night, and even though I knew what I saw, I didn't let it get to me until I started waking up to some type of entity physically on top of me. It was so horrible, I can't even say what it was doing to me. I wouldn't be able to move or speak until it was done with me. I kept telling myself that it had to be a dream, even though I know I was awake. I read everything I could find on this subject, and most people say that it could be a dream. I read a book entitled The Entity, and this was the exact phenomena that I experienced. I suffered in silence for a long time because I just couldn't believe it was real. Until now, I've only told 2 people, my best friend and her son, who is a minister. He told me that the next time it happened that I should pray to God for help and to tell his spirit, in the name of God, leave and never return. I did just that, and after doing this several times, it finally stopped. Even though I couldn't speak, I just thought these words as hard as I could. I have experienced quite a few strange occurrences in my life, but nothing so physical and invading as what I experienced while I was in Japan. Since then, I've read quite a bit on the subject of ghosts and have come to the conclusion that I had inadvertently invited my unfriendly visitor by playing with a Ouija board when I was a teenager. I still sometimes wonder if I was crazy, but I swear that what I experienced seemed too real to be all a dream. And of course, it all stopped once I started to pray. The shadow of a child. I'm a military wife, living on a Marine base in Okinawa, Japan. We have lived in our present apartment for 2.5 years and have experienced a few weird things. It began with the all-so-common door slamming and opening, and it moved to something more real. My husband is a skeptic, a have-to-see-it-to-believe-it kind of person. Well, we heard something together one night that we can't explain. I had put our 3 small children to bed and shut all the bedroom doors and the door to the living area. Our living area couch faces away from that door. My husband and I were sitting there watching a movie when about 15 minutes later we heard the doorknob rattle and the door opened. Then we heard our 3.5-year-old daughter, or what we thought was her, timidly call out, "Mommy?" Well, I tossed my hands up in the air and proceeded to scold her for getting out of bed. I turned to find the doorway empty, so I got up expecting to find her behind the door or scurrying down the hallway, but instead found an empty hallway and all the doors shut. So I checked her room to find her snoozing heavily tucked into her bed, as were the other 2 children. Seriously confused, I walked into the living area to ask my husband if he just heard something. He asked, "What, do you mean Lisa calling your name?" Neither one of us knew what to make of that. After that, on occasion, I would see the reflection of something moving behind me in the steel cabinet in my kitchen. I would turn around expecting to find my husband or one of the kids, but instead found nothing. I would hear my daughter calling Mommy from a few feet away when she wasn't even in the room or in the apartment. The strangest experience was when my husband and I were up watching a late-night show, and from across the room, which was about 20 feet, I could see what appeared to be a shadow standing in the middle of the floor. It was a little girl swinging her arms back and forth. It lasted about 4 or 5 seconds. I was so shocked I couldn't move or say anything to bring my husband's attention to it. Then he noticed my fright and started asking me what it was. Right as he started to look in the direction of the girl, the shadow seemed to just jump up into a cloud mass and back down into the lamp. I have seen a very brief glimpse of a child in the wall mirror that is positioned at eye level for me, which is about 5'3". Just last weekend at a USO on a different base, I filled soda cups for all of us, and then a little girl appeared to run very quickly behind me. I assumed it was my daughter, so I looked around the corner to find her sitting with the family. I went back to the soda machine, and it happened twice more. I don't know what to make of it. Is it a ghost? Is it a projection of my daughter's spirit? She has a very strong personality. I just don't know. I don't get any feelings, evil or otherwise, from whatever it is. but it's strange nonetheless. Who is this little girl ghost? The old lady in white. In the 70s, my husband and I moved into a nice little house in a small Tennessee town. For about the first 6 months, it was our dream house, but then strange things started to happen. When we were in the kitchen, the TV in the living room would change channel. Sometimes the knobs would fly off the TV and land on the floor on the other side of the room. If we were in the living room, we would sometimes hear the kitchen cabinet doors open and close. Every time we were in the bathroom and sat down on the toilet, the light would go out. Stand up and the light would come back on. That was the only comical thing about that house. Things started to disappear around the house. At first, we thought that some of the neighborhood kids were breaking into our house when we were gone. My husband nailed the windows shut from the inside. That seemed to solve our problem for a little while. About 3 weeks later, we took the kids and spent a day with their grandmother. When we returned later that day, what we saw was really horrible. Everything we owned, food, clothes, furniture, toys, everything was in a pile on our living room floor. Our windows were still nailed from the inside and the doors were locked. That night, my husband woke me up in the middle of the night. Standing at the foot of our bed was what looked like a little old woman in a white nightgown. She vanished a second or two later. The next day, we did some research into the house. We discovered that the last owner had died in the room where we slept. We put the house back on the market and a short time later moved to another town. 1 week later, our dream house burned to the ground due to faulty wiring. I will always believe that she ran us away to save our lives, and I thank her. Someone to watch over me. One night while I was sleeping, I dreamt that I was in an old dark basement and it was life or death that I get out. Frantic, I finally was able to open a very large door. As I stepped out to the light, I heard my daughter calling me from the basement. As I turned, I saw her as a baby sitting in her stroller and smiling at me. She was gesturing for me to get her. In reality, she was 12 years old at the time of the dream. The last thing I wanted was to go back through that door to the basement, but I would never leave her there. So back in I went. I held her, but I was not able to leave the basement. I clung to her, and then I woke. I was in a sweat. I even woke my husband. I was so upset. He told me not to worry, that it was only a dream. I could not go back to sleep. I lay there for 20 minutes and then got up and went to the bathroom. After leaving the bathroom, still feeling extremely upset, instead of turning to my bedroom, something made me go to my daughter's room down the hall. As I opened her bedroom door, the smell of something burning almost floored me. I screamed for my husband. We ran in her room looking for a fire but could not find one. We were feeling the wall, thinking the fire was behind them. Nothing. But there was no doubt something was burning. Then my husband looked up at the ceiling and said it was the fan. The motor of our overhead fan was burning. We keep the fans on at night during the summer. We shut the electricity off to assure no further problems. We would take care of it the next day. The funny thing about it was she slept through the whole thing. The next story is upsetting. Still to this day, I have to deal with it each working day. I work in an office with my husband in our own business. We rent a second-floor storefront in an old town. We have been there for about 1.5 years. It started out with my husband calling me from work. He sometimes would have to work late hours, telling me he felt someone was up there with him. This happened often enough, but I would always tell him to come home. He got used to it, and one time he thought someone looked in on him from the other room. But being a typical male, did not take it seriously. Then one Sunday, I had to run in and make out some checks I forgot to mail on Friday. As soon as I went in, I found myself constantly looking down the hall, as if expecting to see someone. Sitting at my desk, I kept looking up, knowing no one would be there. I just couldn't stop. Then it happened. Someone or something was standing in front of me, breathing very hard, very loud. At first, I tried to logically figure it out. When I ruled out anything I could possibly think of, the hair on my neck stood up. My hand was shaking uncontrollably when I called my husband up. He called the police on the other line while he kept me on the phone. Of course, I knew they wouldn't find anyone, but I left the office with them. Since then, I still must go to work. I feel something is there, but there has not been another incident. The next morning on Monday, I talked to whatever it was that frightened me out loud with my husband there. I asked that it not bother me again, as I must work. I told it was a mean thing to do to me. My husband thought it was amusing. Still, what else was I supposed to do if that's where I have to go back to work? The monk. I've known a number of ghosts over the years. The most recent visitation was 2 years ago. I had been in a really stupid accident 6 months earlier that compounded a back problem I was born with. I had been in the supermarket bagging my groceries when I was struck in the back with a shopping cart with 240 pounds of water softener salt in it. A careless dock boy had loaded and shoved it in my direction, letting go of it. The uncontrolled cart struck me at the position of the third and fourth lumbar vertebrae, where I also have scoliosis. After the accident, 2 of my vertebrae were displaced along with the fracture of these 2 vertebrae, which gives me horrendous pain. I've had a lot of physical therapy, acupuncture, drugs, a heavy elastic brace, a sports corset, the type worn by professional football players, and still have tremendous pain. Even months of prayer were of little effect in causing the pain to subside. One night in March, I lay in bed as usual. I was laying on my left side facing my east window. This overlooks the back door, where there is a security light that operates with a motion sensor. By this time, I was more than a little ticked because God was not listening to my pleas for help. I told him to stop ignoring me, and I begged him to send me some saint to give me some sort of comfort. I even asked to be allowed just to dream of having healing massage to ease my discomfort, even a little. As I was in a state of half-sleep, the security light came on, illuminating my room. This light caused me to waken fully. At the same time, I felt the mattress move as a weight settled on it directly behind me. I turned my head and saw a Buddhist monk approximately 30 to 35 years of age kneeling there. I noted he was dressed in a saffron robe and a dark red woolen outer wrap. His left arm and shoulder was bare. He had very closely cropped black hair and even white teeth. His dark, almost black eyes were brimming with feeling. They were the most compassionate eyes I have ever looked into. I asked him who he was and what he was doing there. He told me, "I am the Dalai Lama from 2 times back," and he gave me a Tibetan name I can't pronounce or spell. He indicated he was a previous incarnation of the present Dalai Lama, 2 times removed. He said he had come to give me a healing massage. That was acceptable to me, and I lay back on my pillow and let him work on me. He knew exactly what part of my spine to work on and rubbed, kneaded, and massaged my back until I felt a warm glow penetrating the whole area. I fell into the most peaceful sleep I had had in months. In fact, I remained free of pain for well over 6 months. I really wish he would come back as my back is acting up again. Also, it is really hard to find a healer that makes house calls these days, and the price was so right for an old lady on Social Security. I did go to the library and look up references in the Dalai Lamas. The one I forget the exact number, from 2 times back, died when he was very young. There was very little information available on him. There is a Buddhist temple about 2 to 3 miles directly north of my house, one of about 3 or 4 in the state. Whether this spirit was or is a guardian of that temple, I do not know. I just know he was a wonderful healer with a gentle touch, and he is welcome in my house anytime he chooses to visit. I've had experiences where something or someone has sat on my bed before. I was always too afraid to open my eyes and look at them. I would say a few prayers and they would go away. Next time, I will look to see who or what they are. My guardian angels are there to protect me. Why should I be afraid? One of my physical therapists said, that proves God is non-denominational. My friend's ghost story. Although these stories didn't happen to me, I know that they are true due to the fact that my best friend Ken told me so. Ken and I have known each other since the 1st grade, and we're 25 years old now. He is not the person to lie about this stuff, and especially to me. In short, Ken has never lied to me about anything, ever. We're both from an affluent neighborhood in North Virginia right outside of Washington, D.C. In 1992, I moved to Arizona and he moved to Las Cruces, New Mexico. Now, everyone knows that some funky happenings have gone on in New Mexico. The most recent event occurred when Ken just moved into a new place in town. Late one night, he was awoken by his dog barking very loudly. The dog slept in the same room with him. Ken looked in the direction that his dog Doji was barking and saw in the bathroom doorway, the bathroom was also in the bedroom, a white figure levitating about 3 feet off the ground. Ken told me he looked at it for about 5 seconds, rubbed his eyes, and looked at it again for almost a full minute. Scared half to death, Ken quietly spoke up and said, "Could you please go and leave me alone?" Then it disappeared. The next morning, he brought it up with his new roommate, and soon-to-be girlfriend, as things turned out. and she told Ken that about 3 years ago, a fellow had hung himself in the bathroom. Yet the figure never returned. Ken's older sister Becky, also a very dear friend of mine, moved out to New Mexico in 1993 and found work designing jewelry. And the Christmas of 1995, Ken and Becky decided to do some traveling cross-country back to Virginia, a 2.5-day drive. On their first night of driving, they had an experience together. They were on a lonely 2-lane Texas highway at about 3 a.m. The reason they were on such a road is because they were heading northeast towards I-40 after getting off of I-10. Anyway, they were trucking along, and off in the distance and along the side of the road, they saw what looked like a very bright spinning light, almost like a lighthouse. As they approached the light, Ken slowed down to a mere 10 miles per hour. He said that there was an old house, and in the second-story window there was a very bright light circling. Now for the strange part. There was also a very unearthly buzz or humming sound that would rattle the windows of the truck when it passed their way. Both Ken and Becky told me they would never forget that sound as long as they lived. All of a sudden, both of them sensed extreme evil. Not just uneasiness, but evil. Then Becky started shouting, "Just go, Ken! Just go! Get out of here!" Ken floored it, and they both would look back to see this house off into the distance. About 5 miles later, Ken saw a highway sign that read, "Black, 20 miles." In black, Ken and Becky got off the road and found the room and bedded down for the night. Fast forward to Ken and Becky returning to New Mexico from Virginia. They decided to go back the same way they came to see if this strange house existed. So they went back through black, got on the same stretch of highway, and saw absolutely nothing but open fields for the next 75 miles. Now, I've known this family for a long time, and I know that they would never steer me wrong, and I believe their stories. The question is, what did they see that night? Was it a ghostly house? Something that existed there once, or was it actual time travel? Who knows?